Welcome to the Daily News Currents. Today is Friday, May 2nd, and for today's headlines we have Trump's VA strands thousands of veterans by ending a key mortgage program. People who fled authoritarian regimes say Trump tactics remind them of home. The U.S.-Ukraine mineral deal, what we know. A tidal wave of change is headed for the U.S. economy. Can metformin actually slow the aging process? Trump's VA strands thousands of veterans by ending a key mortgage program. The U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs, as of Thursday, has ended a new mortgage rescue program that so far has helped about 20,000 veterans avoid foreclosure and keep their homes. The move leaves millions of military veterans with far worse options than most other American homeowners if they run into trouble paying their home loans. And it comes at a time when nearly 90,000 VA loans are seriously past due, with 33,000 of those already in the foreclosure process, according to the data and analytics firm ICE. At issue is the VA Servicing Purchase Program, or VASP. It was put in place during the Biden administration after missteps by the VA left homeowners with no affordable way to catch up on their VA-backed home loans if they fell behind. VASP rolls the homeowner's missed payment into a new low-interest rate loan that the VA then owns outright. With today's higher mortgage rates of around 7%, it is often the only affordable option for homeowners with VA loans. But Republicans in Congress have been critical of the VA Servicing Purchase Program, saying it puts too much taxpayer money at risk. In a statement this week to NPR, the VA said, as of May 1st, the program, which was unilaterally created by the Biden administration and lacks congressional authority, will stop accepting new enrollees. Mortgage industry groups, housing advocates, and veteran associations have been warning the VA that shutting down VASP without replacing it with something else first would result in large numbers of veterans losing their homes, many of whom are in this financial peril because of the VA's own mistakes. With the expiration of VASP, tens of thousands of veterans and their families are now at significant risk of losing their homes, said Mike Callon, president of the nonprofit Center for Responsible Lending, a nonpartisan organization that advocates for the federal financial rights of undeserved communities, including veterans. His group is urging Congress to quickly pass legislation to create a new program to fill the gap, and he said VA should extend VASP until its program is up and running. Thousands of veterans left stranded, again. Thousands of veterans were facing foreclosures 2 years after the VA abruptly canceled a key part of pandemic-era mortgage relief program that allowed veterans to skip mortgage payments if they had trouble paying. When the NPR investigation first uncovered the VA's move in late 2023, there were about 40,000 vets in danger of losing their home. Kevin Colon is one of them. Conlon and his wife, Jenny, live in upstate New York, not far from where he was stationed with the Army at Fort Drum. After his 2 combat tours in Iraq, about 12 years ago, the couple had a young kid and were struggling to pay rent and save money. Getting a VA loan meant they could buy a house with no down payment, and since they've been there ever since. That's the longest I've been in one place, said Conlon. Without the VA loan, there was no way we could have afforded to buy a house, the wife added. The VA home loan has long been a bedrock benefit of the GI Bill, giving vets a leg up into the middle class. But all that came unraveled for tens of thousands of vets like Conlon, who were on what's known as the mortgage forbearance. It was supposed to help them during a time of financial hardship by pausing their monthly payments and then giving them an affordable way to start paying again and get current. After NPR reported that VA had shut down the only affordable option for veterans to do that, the VA responded by halting foreclosures for a full year while it rolled out its VASP rescue plan. While they've been waiting to get into VASP, the Conlons have been told not to make payments, so they're falling further and further behind, and they say their family has nowhere to go if they lose this home. I joined right after September 11th, said Conlon, who grew up in Queens, New York, and was in Manhattan the day of the attacks. Conlon's wounds from his time in Iraq aren't visible, but they've taken years to heal. During his 2 combat tours, roadside bombs hit his convoys repeatedly and left him with traumatic brain injuries. On the second tour, his best friend died when he hugged a suicide bomber to the ground, giving his life to protect his friends. The trauma and survivor guilt wounded Colon, he said. As bad as the blast injuries, he struggled with PTSD and thoughts of suicide for more than a decade before finally getting a stable, healthy place. I was willing to die for what I believed in, and for someone to take away the home that my family lives in, like we've really paid enough, he said. Referring to the VA winding down VASP, VA spokesman Pete Kasperowski told NPR this change is necessary because VA is not set up or intended to be a mortgage loan restructuring service. Republicans have their own plan, but it's not in place yet. Republicans critics in Congress don't like that VASP buys the rescued loans from the mortgage industry and then holds the loans on the VA's own books. They say that VA would lose too much money if the homeowners fall behind again. The Trump administration rightfully put an end to VA's VASP program, said a joint statement from Representative Mike Bost, an Illinois Republican and a chairman of the House Committee of Veterans Affairs, and Representative Derek Van Orden, a Wisconsin Republican, when VA announced its plans to end VASP. Van Orden has sponsored a bill to replace VASPs with what's known as a partial claim program that experts say would help vets struggling to keep their homes by moving their missed payments to the back of their loan term so they would pay them back down the road. But between VASP ending and Van Orden's bill possibly becoming law is a chasm that could swallow thousands of VA home loans. Veteran borrowers will face otherwise preventable foreclosures, which harm the government through increased payouts as well as harm veteran homeowners, warned the nonprofit National Consumer Law Center and the Center for Responsible Lending in a letter to Congress last month. Without VASP or immediate access to alternative policy tools that provide relief, many of these homeowners will be forced to sell their homes, move, or face foreclosure, the letter says. In the wake of the move by the VA, Democrats and Republicans in Congress both say they want to pass legislation to give veterans with VA loans better options for avoiding foreclosure, but it's unclear how long that will take. In the meantime, veterans behind on their mortgages have far worse options than other Americans who have loans backed by Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, or the Federal Housing Administration. Those entities all have loss mitigation options that allow homeowners to catch up on missed payments without being forced into a new modified loan at today's high interest rates. Vets left in limbo and disbelief. For their part, veterans interviewed by NPR feel like the VA has now repeatedly stranded them by first offering them a lifeline and then cutting the rope once they've grabbed hold. I feel let down and deceived, said Sam McCary, a Marine Corps vet with 3 young kids in Logan'sville, Georgia. The new VASP program looked like it was going to save his house, but now the VA has ended new enrollments in it, and he says his mortgage company can only tell him his application for VASP is pending. I believe that we are going to lose the house, McCrae said. Losing my house and having to go rent, it makes me sick to my stomach to think about it. Even veterans who've made it into the VASP program aren't sure if they'll be okay. That's because many of those vets are in the VASP 3-month trial payment period. The VA says vets who have entered that process can continue it through August, subject to VA's determination that funds remain available for VASP. The VA did not respond to NPR's request for information about how much funding is available or how many more veterans in these trial periods will in fact be placed into affordable VASP loans. Veterans also tell NPR they feel like they're being scapegoated and paying the price for the VA's mistakes. At a recent House Veterans Affairs Subcommittee hearing, Representative Van Orden criticized VASP this way. I understand the whole developmental process of this, and it was moronic, Van Orden said. It gets rid of a bum loan and passes it off to the American taxpayers. That comment did not sit well with fellow Iraq veteran Conlon and his wife Jenny. It's a hell of a thing to say about his brothers and sisters, said Conlon. That was so hurtful, because these are not bum loans, and they're making the veterans and their families sound like irresponsible people, the wife added. The couple says Kevin took the forbearance so he could get treatment for PTSD. That's why we needed it, so he could go inpatient at a veterans program, Jenny said. The Conlon said they followed the VA's instructions and then got stuck when the VA shut off part of its forbearance program in 2022. Then they followed the VA's instructions again by applying for a new rescue program, VASP, and the VA now says it's shutting it off. Their mortgage company tells them they are enrolled in the VASP trial payment plan, but it's unclear whether the VA will determine it has funding to help all veterans on those trial plans with permanent new VASP loans. And the level of mistrust I have, I get they're trying to cut spending and all that, but it's like, how do you justify cutting something that is to help the vets who are basically put in this position because of you, Conlon said. NPR asked if VA is concerned about veterans losing their home after it shuts down VASP with no replacement ready. A VA spokesman has not answered the question, but at one point referred our reporters to Congress. NPR asked the Republican House VA committee leadership the same question. That office referred our reporters back to the VA. People who fled authoritarian regimes say Trump's tactics remind them of home. Last year, David Corigny attended his mother's 70th birthday party back home in Hungary, but the indirect route he took highlights the autocratic rule that grips his homeland. Instead of flying straight to Hungary, Corigny flew to neighboring Austria and then turned off his phone and drove across the border where there was no passport control and he knew he could slip in undetected. Coriani runs an organization called Action for Democracy that has mobilized Hungarians overseas to vote back home, where political scientists say Prime Minister Viktor Orban has tilted the electoral landscape towards his ruling party. The government said Coriani threatens Hungary's sovereignty, pro-government media routinely calling him an enemy of the state. Friends and even embassies in Hungary told me that maybe it's better if I don't come back to Hungary anytime soon, said Coriani, who was concerned Orban's government might try to detain him. That's like these are the reasons Coriani came to America and became a citizen in 2022. So he's been struck to see the U.S. government agents stopping and aggressively questioning people, including citizens, tourists, and green card holders returning to America. They include Michigan lawyer Amir Makled, who stopped at Detroit Metro Airport in early April as he returned from family vacation. Makled, who said agents asked to search his phone, thinks he was targeted because he represents a pro-Palestinian protester at the University of Michigan. I'm not going to be a dictator. I've never in a million years would have imagined that atmosphere of fear and the random searches at border crossings and looking into people's phones is something I'd have lived through in my life in the United States, said Coriani, who lives in New York. Countless people have left authoritarian countries for promise of freedom and safety in the United States. NPR reached out to Coriani and a dozen others to get their impression of the Trump administration's first several months in power. Most, but not all, said some of the administration's tactics reminded them of those used by the regime they fled. In fact, a survey in February found that hundreds of U.S.-based scholars think the United States is moving swiftly from a liberal democracy towards some form of authoritarianism. This is an elected government, obviously, but it is behaving as an authoritarian one, said Stephen Levitsky, a professor of government at the Harvard University and the co-author of How Democracies Die. It is engaging in a rapid and systematic weaponization of the machinery of government and its deployment to punish rivals, to protect allies, and to bully elements of the media. Some immigrants say Trump is the victim. Last fall, President Trump insisted he would not be an autocrat beyond Inauguration Day, when he said he would all but lock down the southern border and greenlight drilling for energy. After that, I'm not going to be a dictator, Trump pledged to applause at Fox News town hall during the campaign. Some U.S. immigrants from authoritarian countries said Trump has kept his word. Lily Tang Williams, who's running for Congress for a third time in New Hampshire as a Republican, says it wasn't Trump but former President Joe Biden who reminded her of the authoritarian leaders back in her homeland, China. Who censored us during the COVID times and put us in Facebook jail, Tang Williams said in an interview with NPR. It was not Trump. Trump himself was censored. Tang Williams says she blames Biden administration for putting pressure on Facebook and Twitter to crack down on certain posts, including a meme she said she posted about mask mandates. The Biden administration said it was encouraging responsible action to protect public health. If the Trump administration's tactics have unsettled immigrants such as Coriani, they've instilled fear in others such as Fulia Pinar, a professor at Middlebury College in Vermont. Similar authoritarian tactics by Turkey's Erdogan. Pinar grew up in Turkey and says she's watched Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the country's autocratic president, attack scholars and consolidate power over the news media. She says she moved to the U.S. in 2016 to study for her PhD and to have intellectual freedom. It was about survival as an academic, Pinar recalls, to be able to continue thinking, teaching, and writing without fear. Since taking office, Trump has withheld or threatened to withhold billions of dollars in federal contracts and research grants from universities, including Harvard, saying they haven't done enough to fight anti-Semitism. In this atmosphere, Pinar worries some students could report her. She's teaching anthropologies of the Middle East this semester, and doing it so differently than in the past. In her lectures, for instance, Pinar used to cite death tolls for conflicts such as the war in Gaza. Now she directs students to readings where they can find answers on their own. It's a way to insulate herself from charges of bias. Fear in college classrooms. I'm trying to be more careful, says Pinar, who is untenured. At the end of the semester, students usually provide feedback about professors, and then your promotion depends on that. Pinar worries are representative, according to the Middle East Scholar Barometer, which tracks the opinions of scholars who teach about their religion. A survey in February found 57% of professors in the U.S. felt more pressure under the Trump administration to self-censor when discussing Israeli-Palestinian issues. Having left Turkey's autocracy, for Americans' freedom, Pinar says she's never saw a period like this coming. I feel quite fragile because I feel like I can work freely here, Pinar continues. It just feels like I'm stuck. In addition to taking on universities, the Trump administration has also targeted news organizations that cover the president critically. The Federal Communications Commission is investigating broadcast news networks, including ABC, CBS, and NBC, over allegations that they have favored Democrats. Trump has also attacked public broadcasters. In a social media post, he called NPR and PBS radically left monsters that hurt the country, threatening to strip licenses from TV news broadcasters. Journalist Maria Ressa says Rodrigo Duterte, the Philippines' autocratic former president, used similar tactics. In 2020, Duterte's government refused to renew the license of a country's largest broadcaster and shut it down. Duterte left office in 2022 and now is awaiting trial in The Hague on charges of crimes against humanity for allegedly allowing tens of thousands of extrajudicial killings during his war on the country's drug trade. But Ressa says the damage he did to the news media endures. That network, even after the end of Duterte's reign, never got its license back, said Ressa, who once ran the broadcaster herself. What is damaged in the time period, what is destroyed, stays destroyed. Ressa won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2021 for standing up to Duterte's attacks on her and her news site Rappler. At one point, she faced the possibility of more than a century in prison on tax evasion and cyber libel charges that human rights groups say were politically unmotivated. Ressa is spending the semester teaching at Columbia University. A dual citizen, she has a message for people here. Americans are slow to respond, but I know what fear does, she says. Don't let fear paralyze you, because you are your strongest now, and every day you do not act and hold the line on your rights, you get weaker. The U.S.-Ukraine mineral deal, what we know. The agreement came after months of fraught negotiations. Ukraine signed a deal giving the United States control over a share of its future revenue from natural resources, a long-awaited agreement that Kyiv hopes will clear the way for continued U.S. support. The announcement late on Wednesday said the deal had been signed after months of fraught negotiations, including an explosive Oval Office confrontation, as the Trump administration tried to broker an end to Ukraine's 3-year war with Russia. Their agreement, which involves creating a joint investment fund between the countries, is intended to give President Trump a personal stake in the country's fate, while addressing his concerns that the United States has provided Kyiv with a blank check to try to withstand Russia's invasion. It could also clear way for more consequential talks on U.S. military backing for Ukraine and on the terms of possible truce with Russia. What's in the deal? The mineral deal will create a U.S.-controlled investment fund that will receive revenue from Ukraine's national resources, according to the copy of the agreement made public on Thursday. It appears that Ukraine managed to get some of what it wanted, but not everything. The Trump administration had said in March that it wanted Ukraine to repay assistance given during the war with its mineral wealth, which would have financially hurt Ukraine for generations. The idea of treating the aid as debt was removed in the final deal, and the deal appears to significantly keep the door open for Ukraine to eventually join the European Union. There was no mention of a U.S. security guarantee in the text of the 9-page deal that Ukraine's government published on Thursday. Kyiv and Washington will jointly manage the fund, which will be financed with revenues from new projects in critical minerals, oil, and gas, not from projects that are already operating. Although the agreement does not treat past aid to Ukraine as debt and the country needs to repay, it does not say that future military aid, including weapons and training, will be treated as a U.S. contribution to the fund, meaning that Ukraine will need to match future aid with resource wealth. The agreement does not change the management of Ukraine's state-owned energy companies. All natural resources will still be considered Ukraine's property. In addition, the agreement says the United States and Ukraine want to ensure that countries that have acted adversely to Ukraine in the conflict do not benefit from the reconstruction of Ukraine once peace is reached. In other words, Russia. Ukraine's parliament still has to ratify the agreement, which will probably happen in the next 2 weeks, lawmakers said on Thursday. Sticking points along the way. Early drafts of the deal had swiveled between what critics called a brazen extortion of Ukraine by the Trump administration and versions that included points sought by Ukraine, such as references to U.S. support for post-war security guarantees. Without those guarantees, Ukraine said, Russia could quickly violate any ceasefire or restart the war after regrouping and rearming. Mr. Trump said Ukraine should look to Europe, not to the United States, for such security guarantees. What happened in the Oval Office? The deal was initially meant to be signed when President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine visited Washington in February, but the signing ceremony was abruptly canceled after Mr. Trump and Mr. Vance castigated the Ukrainian president in the Oval Office for what they said was not being grateful enough for U.S. support and sought to press him into making a peace deal. Mr. Zelensky was abruptly asked to leave the White House. The United States temporarily froze all military assistance and intelligence sharing with Ukraine. Since then, Mr. Zelensky worked to smooth relations, and both he and Mr. Trump signaled that a deal could be reached. Ukraine's mineral resources. Ukraine controls more than 100 major deposits of critical minerals, according to a study by the Kyiv School of Economics, along with modest oil and natural gas reserves. Titanium, used in construction, airplanes, orthopedic implants, and an additive in paint and cosmetics, including sunscreen. Along with many other things, titanium mines in central Ukraine account for about 6% of global production, according to Ukrainian media. Uranium is used in nuclear power plants and nuclear weapons. Ukraine has Europe's largest reserves. Oil and natural gas fields dot several regions in Ukraine, and surveys conducted before the war found offshore natural gas reserves. Lithium, a critical element in batteries, including those in electrical vehicles and in other industrial products, including some medications. Ukraine has a third of Europe's total reserves, although some sites are in war-contested areas. Before the war with Russia, Ukrainian officials suggested to Elon Musk that he invest in Ukrainian lithium mines. Rare earths, a group of more than a dozen metals, much less abundant than titanium or lithium, that are used in high-tech sectors, including green energy, electronics, and aerospace. Ukraine has substantial reserves that are mostly untapped, and it is unclear how expensive they would be to extract. Manganese, used for steel smelting. Zirconium, used in ceramics industry, nuclear fuel rods, and artificial diamonds. And graphite, used in steel manufacturing and electric motors. Ukraine is the world's leading producers. What happens next? All along, Ukraine has been intent on getting a seat at the negotiating table with Moscow and assuring safeguards against future Russian aggression. Mr. Zelensky has long made clear that the agreement on natural resources is not an end in itself. He is seeking continued American support. A tidal wave of change is headed for the U.S. economy. U.S. consumers are not yet seeing much evidence of the drastic changes President Trump has made on trade, but they are on their way. When the COVID pandemic hit, factories in China shut down and global shipping traffic slowed. Within a matter of weeks, products began disappearing from U.S. store shelves, and American firms that depend on foreign materials were going out of business. A similar trend is beginning to play out, but this time the catalyst is President Trump's decision to raise tariffs on Chinese imports to a minimum of 145%, an amount so steep that much of the trade between the United States and China has ground to a halt. Fewer massive container ships have been plying the oceans between Chinese and American ports, and in the coming weeks far fewer Chinese goods will arrive on American shores. While high tariffs on Chinese products have been in place since early April, the availability of Chinese products and the price that consumers pay for them has not changed that much. But some companies are now starting to raise their prices, and experts say that the effects will become more and more obvious in the coming weeks, as a tidal wave of change stemming from canceled orders in Chinese factories works its way around the world in the United States. The number of massive container ships carrying metal boxes of toys, furniture, and other products departing China for the United States has plummeted about a third this month. The reason consumers haven't felt many of the effects yet is because it takes 20 to 40 days for a container ship to travel across the Pacific Ocean. It then takes another one of those to 10 days for Chinese goods to make their way by train or truck to various cities around the country, economists at Apollo Global Management wrote in a recent report. That means that the higher tariffs on China that went into effect at the beginning of April are just starting to result in a drop in the number of ships arriving at American ports, a trend that should intensify. By late May or early June, consumers should start to see some empty shelves, and layoffs could occur for retailers and logistic industries. The major effects on the U.S. economy of shutting down trade with China will start to become apparent in the summer of 2025. The United States might slip into a recession, said Torsten Slok, an economist at Apollo. U.S. consumers will within a few weeks see empty shelves in clothing stores, toy stores, hardware stores, and retail drugstores, and a higher price of goods that are still on the shelves, he said. Molson Hart, the chief executive of Viahart, a toy company, wrote on X, "It's almost like we're speeding towards a brick wall, but the driver of the car doesn't see it yet. By the time he does, it will be too late to hit the brakes." The decline in Chinese imports will be amplified on Friday when the United States eliminates so-called de minimis treatment for Chinese goods. The rule has allowed products up to 800 to avoid tariffs as long as they're being shipped directly to consumers. It has boosted the business model for companies like Temu and Shein and has resulted in a surge of individually addressed packages to the United States, many of which are shipped by air. Supporters of the change say that the tariff loophole has given Chinese shippers an unfair advantage and hurt American businesses, but the decision to rid of it is already resulting in higher prices for U.S. consumers, and the change is expected to weigh on airlines and private carriers like FedEx, which have a steady business delivering small dollar goods. Port workers and logistic companies have been expecting their own disruptions. At the Port of Los Angeles, the main entry point for Chinese products arriving in the United States, imports surged in recent months as business and consumers tried to stock up on goods in advance of the tariffs coming into effect, but that activity has now started to decline. The number of containers arriving at the Port of Los Angeles is expected to drop more than 35% next week, compared with the same period last year, data report shows. Jean Soroka, the port executive director, said the quarter of the ships that had been scheduled for May had canceled because of light volume. As of about 2 weeks ago, goods coming into the port from China have been very few and far between, Mr. Soroka said. Data shows that the sales of heavy trucks have fallen sharply too, suggesting that companies in the logistics space expect to be moving fewer goods in the future. Trade experts say that companies have stockpiled enough inventory in recent months that if the White House reserves course soon and significantly drop tariffs on China, much of the pain for the U.S. economy and consumers can be avoided. Data from the Institute for Supply Management shows that U.S. inventories are at their highest level in more than 2 years. Gabriel Wadow, a managing director at Tenno, who advises companies on doing business with China, said that the Chinese good and the retailers had stockpiled in the first 3 months of the year would give some stores some time before they would need to raise prices. But the situation has not changed quickly. American consumers will feel the impact of trade changes unfold over the next 3 to 6 months, he said. We're going to have higher prices and in some cases empty shelves, he said. Trump officials have admitted that there would be some disruptions for consumers. The president seemed to acknowledge on Wednesday that his trade changes could lead to fewer goods and higher prices. You know, somebody said, "Oh, the shelves are going to be open," Mr. Trump said from the White House. "Well, maybe the children will have $2 instead of $30, you know? Maybe the $2 will cost a couple more bucks more than they would normally." But administration officials have said any pain will be minimal. At a White House briefing on Tuesday, Scott Bessent, a Treasury Secretary, said that he did not expect the supply chain stocks from U.S. tariffs on China. "I think retailers have managed their inventory in front of this," he said. Some firms that are in more fragile financial position have not been able to stockpile and are rapidly being forced out of business. Even if the Trump administration finds a way to reduce its tariffs on China, it is clear that the levies will fall enough to meaningfully restart trade. Many companies say the tariffs above 50% on Chinese imports are enough to stop trade entirely. With tariffs now at a minimum of 145% and in some cases much higher, that would mean that Trump administration would have to drop its Chinese tariffs by at least 100 percentage points to meaningfully restart the flow of goods. Trump officials have said they believe the current tariff rate with China is unsustainable, but they have concerns about Chinese trade practices, and they will be under pressure to show that they have secured significant concessions from China in return for dropping the tariffs. Ryan Peterson, a chief executive of Flexport, a supply chain company, said that even before the president hiked tariffs on China to 145% this month, the tariffs the Trump administration had put on China were high, at a minimum of 54%. The reality is that 54% was already an incredibly high tariff rate, Mr. Peterson said. It depends on how far they walk it back. If they walk it back to 25%, maybe this all becomes a non-event. With so much unclear about where the global trade is headed, companies are freezing their plans for expansion and halting new orders. Data shows that new orders from manufacturers have turned down sharply this year, while companies have trimmed back their plans for capital expenditures. Some major companies have stopped issuing guidance for their sales and profits. Mercedes-Benz on Wednesday suspended its financial forecast for 2025, as did Stellantis, which makes the Chrysler, Dodge, and Jeep brands. It's not clear how quickly the current supply chain challenges could be resolved, but during the pandemic, supply chain disruptions took much longer to work their way through the economy than most forecasters had anticipated. Economists who initially expected price increases to be transitory were surprised at the inflation pressures that lingered for years. Small impacts also had a way of snowballing through supply chains. For example, a disruption in supply from one or two companies making small parts for cars or other machinery could end up stopping a major manufacturing plant, which found it had no alternative for the part. When the economy turned back on again after initial pandemic disruptions, the process was not smooth. Americans saw pileups at the ports, the shortages of some goods, all of which ultimately contributed to higher prices. Mr. Peterson said that the companies that operated container ships had already canceled a quarter of all sailings to the United States from China, and they are rerouting their ships to travel to Southeast Asia and Europe instead. Even if the Trump administration removes its China tariffs and U.S. consumers' demand for Chinese products resumes, ships won't be in the right location immediately to carry the same volume of goods, he said. You'll see higher prices, you'll see delays, Mr. Peterson added. The longer you wait to make changes, the more severe the shock will be. That is all that we have for today. Thank you so much for listening. Goodbye!